You sit across from wealthy people, right? You haven't met them before.
hmm
How unnatural it is. Say you have a person in front of you, they have a $10 million or $20 million portfolio,
hmm
and they're meeting you for the first time. How unnatural is it not to say to that person, I'm really interested in how you got from where you were to where you are? Just saying to them, tell me how you got from where you were to where you are. What's it feel like to be you right now? To be sitting down with me planning this next stage of your life. Think about how that meeting would go if that was the conversation. That's how powerful emotions are.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Dan Solin. He practiced law in New York City. He represented investors harmed by misconduct of brokers. He worked as a registered investment advisor. He's a New York Times best-selling author of the Smartest series of books, including the Smartest Money book you'll ever read. Today we talk about his wonderful book, Ask: How to Relate to Anyone. I absolutely loved the book. I greatly enjoyed this discussion, and I immediately called it a masterclass in the art of conversation with a focus on investment advisors becoming better at what we do. Please help me welcome Dan Solin. Hello, Dan. How are you? It's so nice to see you.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you. I'm really looking forward to this episode.
I loved your book, and I wrote to you that I loved your book, and then you responded that anybody who writes to anybody that they loved their book will get a reply.
Absolutely. Why not? I mean, it's the nicest compliment an author can have, especially from somebody as qualified as you are. I mean, it's very flattering, and it never gets old. No matter how many times you hear it, you just want to hear it more. That's why I write books, and I think most authors would agree.
No, I love that. I wrote a few books, and I always tell people that if you liked it, write something. I definitely reply, even in the shortest way that I can, but I do reply, and I do want to encourage everybody to always write to the authors. If you love the book, write them something, because you never know. You might make their day, and maybe it could lead to a conversation like this one today. So I'm grateful I wrote, and I'm grateful you replied, and I'm very grateful you're here. Dan.
So thanks for all that. You know, you're right. I think people think authors are like too busy, and I personally have rarely written to an author, but I think it's wonderful what you did, and I wish more people would write to us because that's the feedback that we're all looking for.
I feel like the moment you write a book, the book takes a life of its own and it's out of your control. And then people stop me somewhere at an event, at a conference, and say, oh, this is you, this is your book. And then they tell me a story about how this book, the books I wrote, made an impact on them. I wrote books about money, life, family, about investing, and my experience managing money for wealthy families. And it resonated with so many people in so many different parts of the world in so many ways that I could have not predicted. So you don't have control over how people will embrace your book, but if they do, drop us a little line, we'll read it. Dan, I want to jump right in, and you might know already that my favorite question to start with is about the early days, childhood upbringing, and I'm very, very curious how you think those days influenced you, your interests, and the many careers you've had that we'll talk about in a minute, but take us back to those early days if you indulge us.
So, by the way, what's happening to my brain right now when you ask that question is it's kind of on, think of it as being on fire. It's like, oh boy, I get to talk about myself. This is going to be great. I'm feeling great now. And so I have to like put a kind of, and I always think this way, let's not get carried away that people are really interested in my background. So let's keep it really short so that I don't lose the audience. I mean, that's the way I think based on the research that I've done. So, born and brought up in a small town in Western Massachusetts, typical middle class background. I think what influenced me more than anything else was not anything in my background, but really what's in my DNA, which is I'm an introvert. And I think that's something I write about, but I think being an introvert really is, I think back all those years, trying to think like, why don't I belong here? Because introverts were minorities generally. Why am I not experiencing the same kind of fun as everybody else? And why do I feel so awkward in social situations? And why do, when I go to parties, can I not wait to leave? Um, those are the kinds of things that propelled me to write this book. I mean, as I think back on.
I love the sound of that, and I can relate to that. I don't really like being in crowds, and I love having deep conversations. And in a way, this podcast is exactly up my alley. I can sit down with somebody that I admire, respect, and spend an hour with them and have a really meaningful conversation that they will remember and I will remember. And in so many social settings, I feel like I can't reproduce that. It's either quick, either it's shallow, and it's very forgettable. And my wife makes fun of me that I just zone out in those moments. I'm mentally gone. And then, before we get into your book, I want to ask you about the many career paths that you've taken. So I'm reading that you are the New York Times bestselling author of the Smartest series that we'll talk about. And you wrote the book, The Smartest Investment Book You'll Ever Read. But you also have experience as a financial advisor. And early in your book, you mentioned that you were a trial lawyer and you have quite a few thoughts about jurors and how the process works. And you want some cases for your clients. Tell me more about this journey. How did it come about? So many different fields, but they have something in common.
So, really, my career path for most of my adult life was being a lawyer, which I really enjoyed. So, I was a lawyer in New York. And I had a varied career. I started with a large Wall Street law firm where I got great training. And then I went with a large international conglomerate where I did international law and traveled all over the world, which was just no end of fun and incredibly broadening for somebody who had probably, when I started, been on a plane once or twice to commute to college and hadn't traveled anywhere and had no world view of any kind. Then I formed my own law firm. And at the end of my legal career, about 30 years or so, I started representing investors who'd been harmed by the misconduct of their brokers. And I was stunned by this. I knew very little about finance. I knew nothing about investing. But I was stunned when I was trying those cases at how little the brokers knew about investing and how they were just trained commission salespeople and how how some of them, by no means all, victimize their clients. It was just a tremendous eye-opener. And so when I had the luxury of being able to do what I wanted, I said, well, why don't I prevent people from being harmed? So why don't I be a financial advisor, do it the right way? And then the next logical iteration of that was, well, I could have an even greater impact if I wrote a book and said, okay, this is the way you should invest. And everybody said, well, the last thing the world needs is another financial book. But I wrote the smartest investment book you'll ever read in 2006. The title is not meant to be arrogant, presumptuous. It's not the smartest investment book ever written, but it was the smartest investment book that everybody could read and simply implement without using me or any other financial advisor. And the New York Times picked up on that, did a half-page review in the Sunday edition, and I was off to the races. I mean, that was a big break, isn't it?
But in a way, you wrote yourself out of a...
Yeah, I wrote myself out of a job for some investors, but for larger investors, they were attracted to the fact that I wrote the book.
I'm an investment advisor myself, and I work with some wonderful clients that I enjoyed working with for many years. And I realized that we do play a role in people's lives, and we can help them in many different ways. And I know a lot of friends that try to do it all on their own. And I think it's a big task. It's a second job, and you can automate it and do it in various ways. But emotionally, I think it's a second job. So I grew to appreciate what a role I play in people's lives, especially in those difficult times when they can give me a call and I can talk to them, and we stay invested through the hard times, or we don't do silly things when other people do silly things. That's probably the biggest value I can add in a nutshell. I want to jump into your book. The book is called Ask How to Relate to Anyone. And it's a wonderful book because, as I told you earlier, I think we all could learn to have better conversations and be better listeners. And I think everybody could embrace this book, and it would be a nicer world to live in. At the beginning of your book, you say something that really struck a chord with me. When you jump into a conversation, when you join the conversation, you say it's not about us. It's not about trying to be witty, charming, or entertaining. It's not about conveying information or demonstrating expertise. It's about listening to others and asking them questions. It really flips the whole logic that a lot of us have about a conversation on its head. We don't have to go in and show how smart we are, all the technical knowledge we have. Actually, we have to remain silent, ask the right questions, and just listen. Can you talk about that?
This was a tremendous breakthrough for me. I mean, I loved writing this book because it really improved my own self-awareness and actually changed my life. I learned so much. You know, let's take the situation of you and me where we just met, right? And I mean, here you are with a name that is clearly not an American name, right? You have a very interesting background. You've done a lot of things in your own life. So when I meet you, I have two choices. I can talk about myself and try to impress you with how smart I am, how successful I am. But I know anything I'm saying to you, I already know. It's not news to me. I mean, whatever good and bad there is about me, I already know. So I'm not really adding to my own knowledge. Or I can spend time getting to know you, a new person who's obviously interesting, has a story to tell. So why wouldn't it make sense for me to explore who you are? That's actually interesting to me. Who I am is not interesting to me. So logically, when I did the research, that makes a lot of sense. Like, oh, I don't really have the burden of convincing you of anything. And if you're curious about something, you're going to ask me. And when you ask me, I'm going to answer. But then I'm going to turn the conversation back to you so I can learn more about you. That's going to be a fulfilling way for me to interact with you.
I love the sound of that. And I wonder where it comes from that we do the opposite. Maybe it's the education, maybe it's the school, where we're always put in a position where we have to impress the teacher. Then we have to impress somebody to get the first job. Then we have to impress the client, right? And we always feel like we are on stage performing. But you say, no, grab a seat and be the audience, which I think is revolutionary.
So, sometimes I feel like with this book, I self-published this book. So my previous books were published by Penguin before they became Random House. This one I self-published. I'm not sure that was the smartest thing I could have done because it didn't get the distribution that a big publisher could give it. I really felt I didn't need them because I already had a following. But sometimes I feel like I have discovered a new productive way to interact. That should be a headline somewhere. I mean, I've taught this to thousands of people all over the world, and they almost universally write me saying, this has changed my life. I mean, it's changed everything about my life. So that makes me incredibly happy, but I'd love to get it out to more people because it has a profound effect. The answer to your question, why do we feel that way? Why do I feel when I first meet you, if I didn't do this research, it would be so I need to impress you in some way. I need to convey that I'm a smart guy and that I need to let you know what my status is in some way, and maybe even be competitive with you. Why is that? So the answer lies in neuroscience, basically. When we're talking, the prefrontal cortex of our brain gets an injection of dopamine or oxytocin or both. Those are feel-good neurotransmitters. They make us feel great. So right now I'm talking, lecturing, educating. You're being passive and sitting there. And if I continue doing this for much longer, I'm going to lose you. First, the attention span of humans is relatively short, 9 minutes at the most. Some have said 9 seconds, but it's somewhere between 9 seconds and 9 minutes. So one great article by a woman, whose last name is Susan Glazer, said that when you talk and other people are listening, you're feeling great, you're on fire, you're feeling terrific. What's going on in the brain of the other person is akin to physical pain. So I think about that. So that's why we love to talk, because it feels good. So we have to be incentivized to give that up.
It's a big statement that listening could feel like physical pain. I think it would be more productive for us as a society, to have the experience of listening to be at least as enjoyable as the talking part, wouldn't it?
So it's a trade-off, right? And the way I get out of the physical pain is I know what's going to happen to our relationship if I ask questions about you. And I know what's going to happen if I just talk. If I just talk, you're going to kind of think I'm a jerk who's showing no curiosity whatsoever about you. And you're going to leave that encounter thinking, I kind of wish I never saw him again. I mean, he seems so narcissistic, so egocentric. He showed no interest in me as a person. Is that the impression I really want to make with you or with anybody else? And the answer is no. I do have an agenda. I want it, in a social setting, I want it to be a productive conversation that you're going to feel good about, and then I'm going to feel good about it, and you're going to feel good about me, and I'm going to feel good about what just happened. That's the trade-off. And when I keep in mind what's going to happen, then I say, okay, yes, I'm listening more than I'm talking, but the benefit to me is incalculable, particularly as an introvert. My process is easier for introverts because we don't like to talk anyway. So we're reluctant. We're not excited about talking. So I'll just tell you a quick story. Before COVID, I used to give a lot of talks. So I could talk before a couple hundred people and it didn't bother. I really enjoyed it for all the reasons I just said. Prefrontal cortex on fire, people listening, laughing at my jokes. This is good. Afterwards, there would always be networking events. lots of people, lots of soundbite conversations like the ones you said you didn't enjoy having, nothing substantive, a lot of noise. This was hell for me. My brain got overstimulated, and all I could think about was, how do I get out of this without
Right.
offending anybody? So that's kind of the way the brain works, and that's what I learned about how to interact.
You have this quote about happiness in your book. You say that, in the way I read it, that listening is a shortcut to happiness in a way. Being kind and compassionate is a quick and easy path to increased happiness, which I thought is a bonus to the experience. You're not just getting to know people, you're learning about them, but selfishly a little bit. It leads to your own happiness. Can you talk about that?
Well, I can only tell you about my own life, right? I used to dread meeting new people and all social interactions. And while fortunately my wife is an introvert as well, but let's hypothetically said she came to the house one day and said, "We've been invited to a large New Year's Eve party." This for me would be a consignment to hell. I mean, I really I don't like parties. I certainly don't like New Year's Eve parties, anything where there's a lot of celebration. But let's say it was important to her to go. I could get through it. And I could get through it by every time somebody comes up to me, all I would do is ask them questions. So tell me a little bit more about yourself. And then I would ask nice, soft follow up questions. And at the end of the evening, instead of feeling overstimulated, bitter, maybe a little hostile, I would actually feel happy. I actually find myself now looking forward to meeting new people because it's so easy when you figure out all you have to do is show a genuine, everything about my process is authentic. So you can't fake anything, but I'm genuinely curious. I'm curious about everything. That's why I write books. So to me, showing an interest in other people comes very naturally. And for most introverts, it does. Harder for extroverts.
I love the story of giving a big talk, which you mentioned in the book as well, and then having the time after that. I gave a TEDx talk a few years back, and it was stressful to be on the stage, but I felt more comfortable talking to a large audience. And I couldn't really see the faces. The room was dark. I just saw somebody had glasses, so the light would reflect. I would see that. And then after that, I had to stay and talk to everybody. And I kind of turned the tables and I was asking them questions like, who are you? What brought you here? Why are you curious in this particular topic? I was talking about investing. And I think I figured out the trick. And obviously your book gives so much more advice on that topic. But I got through those few hours that followed by asking questions.
So this is fascinating to me. I mentioned to you that I used to give a lot of talks. So when I started giving talks, I gave them like everybody else. PowerPoint, a lot of data, me talking, 50 minutes, and then that awkward pause. Anybody have any questions? Then hoping somebody would ask a question because you feel like you failed if nobody asked a question. And I got decent feedback. That's the way everybody gave talks. Then I did this research. And then I said to the large fund family that was sponsoring me, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to do it entirely differently. What we're going to do is it's not going to be my talk interrupted by questions. It's going to be the questions from the audience interrupted by my talk. I'm not doing a presentation for 50 minutes when I've cited to data that says that after 9 minutes at most people phase out. So what we're going to do is whatever subject I'm talking about, we'll send out a little questionnaire to people. We'll get them to reveal who they are. I have a talk tomorrow. It's going to go exactly this way. It's a webinar. And they said, how could you do this in a webinar? I said, it's very easy. We're going to send out this questionnaire. We're going to get information from the audience. And then the way we're going to start it is, oh, Bill, I see that you're interested in X. Tell me more about that. And all I'm going to do is ask the audience questions and encourage them to ask questions. And I'm going to say, if you guys don't have any questions for me, it's going to be a really short webinar because I don't have a presentation. My ratings went off the roof when that happened. It was like a Q&A. It was like a press conference. where the audience was deeply involved. We never had enough time. So I took it from traditional presentation followed by a networking event where I asked questions to the whole thing is just asking questions. And it turns out, as you found out, you can ask questions of a large group. You can ask, when dealing with an audience who are generally reluctant at the beginning to volunteer, you can say, how many people, just raise your hands, how many people made a first impression of me within the first 30 seconds of seeing me? People are not shy about raising their hands. And then you pick out one and you say, tell me more about that. Like, what did you base your impression on? I've done that at 100 talks and never looked back. Then it was just more questions. Tell me more. And by the way, who are you? How'd you become a financial advisor? How did you, why are you still, I mean, it just goes on. It's amazing what happens when you do this. Absolutely amazing.
I love this idea, and I would love to be in a webinar like this. And I feel like if all talks were in that format, with engaging the audience and giving us a chance to ask you questions, the way I have this opportunity today to ask you questions. But speaking of questions, I'm learning in your book that we have to learn to listen and ask questions, but not any kind of questions. You have specific questions in mind, and you have some advice on that topic. What kind of questions should we be asking?
So there are two kinds of questions. Questions that most sales coaches, for example, recommend, which I can't find support for, which are questions that drive an agenda. So if you're a financial advisor, for example, having a conversation with a prospect, those questions are geared to find out, is that prospect a viable candidate for your services, and get them to reveal what their experience has been. They're financially oriented questions. So when I coach financial advisors, I say, I do not want you to ask any questions that have an agenda. I want soft, open-ended questions. So I'll give you a quick story as to how this works. I coached a financial advisor who was about to have a meeting with a large prospect. He did exactly what I said. Called me afterwards. I said, how did it go? He said, horrible. I said, tell me why. He said, the prospect was into fly fishing. The advisor was in Oregon, where that's a big deal. And so am I. All we talked about was fly fishing the entire period of time. Never asked me a single question. Never asked what I do, why I did it. I said, I'm giving you a 99% chance of landing that prospect as a client. He said, how could you say that? I said, because think of every other presentation he's had where the advisor goes to the whiteboard, lectures for 50 minutes, and the guy is bored out of his mind, and they got that prospect. Open-ended questions where people talk. Those are the kinds of questions you should be asking. No agenda.
Love that. No agenda. Nothing about the technical side of what you do.
No.
Just being curious about the other human being that's on the other side of the table.
Instead of being the smartest person in the room, you want to be the most curious person in the room. Instead of being the most interesting person in the room, you want to be the most interested person.
That's a skill, and I feel like we can all learn it. And I feel like I developed it to some extent, and your book definitely will allow me to take the next leap. And I'm always curious, and my wife makes fun of me that we get in a cab in a foreign country, and right away I'm talking to the taxi driver. I don't know. If you put me in front of a large group, a mixer, a networking event, I would freeze. But if you put me in a one-on-one conversation, I feel like everybody has a story, as you mentioned before. And I do want to hear that story. And it's fascinating to learn about people's lives. So I don't know any other way. I just ask questions. The driver might know nothing about me. Even the hotel I'm going to, he might forget where he's driving, but I'll know everything about him at the end of that experience. Then, related to that, I want to bring our attention to the follow-up question, which is very important, and you bring it up in your book. I feel like we sometimes ask the question and we just don't know where to go with it next. And you bring up the science of selling and David Hoffelt and his book, how we are wired to disclose information in levels. You talk about layers like an onion. And for that onion to keep on getting revealed, we need the follow-up question. Can you talk about the idea? How do we ask the right follow-up question?
So generally, there's something called there's active listening and there's competitive listening, right? Competitive listening is I'm pretending to listen to you, but I can't wait for you to stop talking so I can say something that is obviously much more important. That's competitive listening. Active listening is what you do very well, by the way. I'm really listening to what you're saying. And when you really listen to what people are saying, it makes sense. It's very easy to ask follow-up questions, which the best one is, tell me more about that, or how did that make you feel, or what was that experience like? Because you're not waiting for them to stop talking. You're into their talking. This is not, and as I mentioned, I was a former lawyer. This is not a lawyer cross-examining a witness. You're not forcing people to talk. If people don't want to talk, that's fine. Then they'll ask you questions and you'll start answering questions. You want whatever makes for a comfortable interaction. But I can tell you that 99% of the time, people just want to talk about themselves. They really have no interest in us. They just want to talk about themselves. And you will be one of the reason you will be memorable in their lives is that there's practically nobody in their life who gives them permission to just talk about themselves without some competing agenda going on where you say, I just took a trip to France for 2 months, and I say, when we go to Europe, we always stay 6 months because we feel 6 months, that never happens. I mean, all people are always competitive. They're always trying to prove something. But then you come across that one person who has nothing to prove. They're just trying to get to know you. You will be memorable in that person's life.
You create a certain safe space and you just listen. And when I was reading that part, I was thinking that people will bring up topics that I'm not familiar with. You said fly fishing. I went fishing with my grandpa decades ago and I have no experience in it. But when I was reading that part of the book, I realized I can ask follow-up questions, not being an expert in the field. You build rockets and send them to the moon. I know nothing about it. I'm fascinated. I want to learn more about it. But in a way, the less I know about your field or your passion, the easier it is for me because, first of all, I can't compete with you. I never build a rocket. But you seem to be building them every weekend. So I want to hear about it, right? So
Exactly.
It felt very, very empowering that I don't have to know so much about the field you're just about to introduce me to. But I have unlimited number of questions to ask you because it's a new field to me. Is that how you look at it?
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
You have another quote and another story from Pema Chodron. You talk about, you say, let your curiosity be greater than your fear. And I thought of it as a very interesting way of looking at curiosity. You say, you also share how curiosity can lead to happiness. So 2 things. The curiosity helps us overcome fear and then leads to happiness. But curiosity is a big, big aspect of it. Tell me about that dynamic with fear. Were you thinking about the fear of interacting with a crowd or other kinds of fear?
I never had a fear of interacting with the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
I always had a fear of interacting with people because I always felt awkward.
Mm-hmm.
I always felt like I don't really belong here. It wasn't even imposter syndrome, although I do have a little bit of that. It was just, I don't feel comfortable in this environment. But once I worked on developing curiosity, all of that changed. As I said, it's helpful that I am legitimately curious. I'm intellectually curious. In your example of somebody comes in, they're a rocket scientist, you know nothing. That for me is nirvana because I don't want to learn. I know a lot about investing. It's unlikely that if I meet the average person, they're going to be able to teach me a lot about investing. Somebody's in a field I know nothing about, I'm going to learn a lot. So that showing curiosity is just a wonderful trait. I had to work on it a little bit because it wasn't my initial instinct like everybody else. My initial instinct is talk about myself. They must be interested in me. It was, it sounds a little harsh to say nobody's interested in us. Our loved ones are interested in us, but even they have their own agendas, it seems to me, right? I mean, they have their own lives. They have their own, people come home. I used to talk about this, like, what's going to happen? You're at this conference now. You've heard this talk by me. You're going to go home. What's the first thing your loved one is going to say when they greet you after this 3-day trip? Everybody would say, how was your trip? That's what they're going to say. And what's your inclination? Your inclination is to talk endlessly about the trip, about you, about what happened. What about them? And so instead of doing that, you could say, it was a great trip. I heard an interesting speaker. I really enjoyed his talk. What did you do while I was gone? And then keep going. What would happen if you actually showed a genuine interest in the other person who you love in your life and just kept saying, why did you do that? Or was that fun? Is that something you would do again? How difficult is it for you when I'm gone? I mean, you've got the children and, what could we do to make that easier? I mean, it just leads to, it's just amazing when you turn on that spigot. It is amazing what happened. I would say the happiest times of my life have been, I put them on my website, danielsolin.com. People who write me saying, I did what you told me to do and it changed my life, but not in the way you thought, Dan. You thought it would just help me convert more prospects into clients. It definitely did that. But the real benefit was my relationship with the people in my life that I love, my children, my spouse, my friends. It's been amazing how my relationship has transformed because I now am so acutely aware of showing a genuine interest in them.
I love that aspect that family and friends, and we learn to listen to them, and we grow even closer to them. We're more on top of what's going on, and I definitely try to practice that. And then there's the outside world, obviously clients, but then even beyond that, people we don't know, people we just met. And there's something I asked you about before we hit record, and you reminded me to not forget that. We spoke about the idea that you go to an event, and I had that experience. I had that experience that I created a space for everybody to talk. And I know so much about everybody at the event or a party or a conference. But I come back home and I feel like people don't know me because I never really had a chance to say anything about myself. And I told you that my practice sometimes is to sneak in something about me so that they not only remember they had the most interesting listener or interested listener, but also they can say, oh, the listener is from New York, he has an investment firm, he works with families. So at least they have 3 data points and he's from Poland with an interesting name. So they have 3-4 data points to in their database, in their head. So when I call them, they're like, oh, that's you. But you say it's not necessary to sneak it in. Can you talk about it?
So I would ask everybody when I gave talks, I would say, do any of you have somebody in your life who just asks you questions and makes you feel really special? And you feel like you're the only person that matters because they're so interested in you. And in every audience of 100, one or two people would raise their hands. And I would say, tell me about that person. And they would say, oh, that's my mother, my best friend. And I would say, and what is it they do that makes you feel that way? And they would say, they just show such an interest in me. They just make me feel so special. And then I would ask this question, and this is the answer to your question. And how do you feel about them? And they would say, I love them. There is nobody in my life that I love more than. And then I would say, what if in this room of 100 people, instead of one person raising their hand, everybody but one person raised their hand and said, that person is Bill sitting right there. Bill makes me feel that way. And what if you were that person? So when you go to those parties, and I've had this experience 100 times. I could so relate to that when you told me that story. Nobody ever asks my wife or I anything. I mean, they really don't. We're both reasonably interesting people. I mean, I've written 9 books. My wife is an accomplished artist who's far better read and more intelligent than I am. Nobody ever talks to us by saying, well, nobody ever says to her, what do you do? I mean, people, they just assume she does nothing, apparently. So, but I say, because we ask those questions, they'll never forget us. So you don't have to worry about being forgotten. You will be the most memorable person in their life. They'll say, I want to get together with those people again. And I've often gotten, I went to this party once. It was a surprise birthday party. It had all the elements that I don't like: surprises, birthday party, and travel. And this one woman cornered me, and all I did was ask her questions. And then we had to leave. My wife came and said, oh, I'm sorry, Dan, we have to go now. We have to catch a plane back. She wrote me the nicest, she said, I've never had such an interesting conversation, Dan. I so enjoyed our talk. We didn't have a bilateral conversation. She knows nothing at all about me, but she remembers somebody who showed an acute interest in her, and it compelled her to write this really touching email telling me what a memorable experience it was.
I love that, because what it tells me is that I can relax. I don't have to make sure that a little bit about me makes it into the conversation. It's enough that they remember.
Exactly.
And in your book, you do say that eventually the tables do turn and people ask you some questions. So just wait for it and it will come about. So it gave me some peace of mind. But it's fascinating because our reflex is to be memorable. You have to remember something about me, but your book says the opposite.
You're memorable because there's nobody else in their life with whom they just had a conversation remotely similar to the conversation they just had with you.
I have to ask this, but do you think a person like this could be taken advantage of as this open-ended listener, especially on a long flight when you're sitting next to somebody who seems to have endless stories to share? To absolutely anybody that would listen, I have to ask this question.
I never feel taken advantage. I've had that experience. You know, again, as an introvert, I don't talk to the people next to me when I'm traveling. Like, I could be on a 10-hour flight. I would not say a word to the person next to me. But people, particularly if they're extroverts, they want to talk to you.
They do.
And then all I do is ask them questions. And at the end of and I've had flights where people have said, just like that experience I just told you, here's my card. We have to keep in touch. I so enjoyed talking to you. And again, we didn't have a conversation. I just asked some questions. But I don't feel taken advantage of. I really enjoy the conversation. I enjoy the conversation. Now, in truth, on a plane, I would like to be left alone for the most part. I would be happier being just reading or even just thinking or sketching out some ideas for my next blog or my next book. So sometimes I do, but it's very rare. I really enjoy it. I enjoy, it's like a lab experiment. Every time this happens, it's like, wow, my book was actually prescient. It works perfectly. It always works. And whenever I try it, it's always like a refreshing surprise. Oh, I could see how much he enjoyed that conversation. This is great. Great for me and great for them.
I love that. Airplanes are different because you can't step away, excuse yourself. You always have to come back to the seat. So
yeah, that's the issue on planes.
That's a unique experience. Dan, I want to ask you about introverts, extroverts, and social interactions. And you mentioned a little bit throughout the conversation. You have a quote from Malcolm Gladwell, who actually I heard speak, and I think he's as good of a writer as he's a speaker. He's a wonderful storyteller. I don't know, he has a gift, and I'm sure it's also years of experience and skill, but he knows how to captivate the audience. But he says, and you mentioned it in your book, that speaking is not an act of extroversion. It's a performance. Why is that?
So you must have felt this during your TED Talk, right?
I did.
Maybe, because I suspect you're an introvert. You seem
I am.
somewhat introverted to me. And for introverts, we don't normally like to be the center of attention. Like there aren't people congregated around us in a social occasion while we hold court. Holding court is not something we really look forward to. So it is a performance. It's a little, meaning it's a little unnatural for us. But once we adapt, once we understand, okay, this isn't my authentic self. I would rather be talking to one person on the side of this event. That would actually make me happy. But I do have a point I'm trying to make. And answering questions and restructuring talks the way I've done, makes it very easy for me. But I thought it was a prescient quote, and I'm a big fan of his as well. I love his books. It is a bit of a performance, but the rest of it, the rest of the introvert extrovert, that's just DNA. That's just who we are. So it's very important when I meet somebody, like when I met you first thing this morning, the very first thing that I thought of was he seems like more of an introvert than an extrovert, which generally means this is going to be a good conversation because introverts tend to be more curious. Extroverts are still, when they're interviewing, are still trying to make a point. They're still trying to dominate the conversation. So understanding, it's terribly important to understand whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, but equally important whether the person you're talking to is an introvert or an extrovert, because they're going to react very differently. For example, if you said to me, Dan, tell me about yourself, in my brain, the way that filters is, I'm going to tell you as little as possible, like how I started writing books, and make you ask me questions, because I'm not going to do Dan 101 for 20 minutes. If you say to an extrovert, tell me about yourself, you can sit back and relax for a half an hour. They've got a lot to talk about. So understanding that's very helpful.
It's very true. And we pick up on it right away. But also, I feel like I developed a way to interact with the world that works for me. And also, this podcast, in a way, it's a safe, warm place for an introvert. Because, I mean, I do have an audience, but I forget about the audience, right? I don't have to look over my shoulder and see all the eyes and all the faces and their facial expressions. I don't see it. I hear from them now and then, which I love. I appreciate. But in a way, it's just the two of us having a conversation that nobody could hear, we think, could ever hear. But it's a safe space, and we can have a deeper conversation. I also feel like the people I've had on the show that I know I've known for many years, I could never replicate this kind of experience in real life. At a restaurant or a coffee shop, we get interrupted. Somebody brings the coffee, then they ask if we want a cake, and there's the bill to be paid, and somebody's changing tables, they want to borrow a chair. There's always something going on. But in this setting, you have my full attention, and I know I have your full attention, and somehow it's very alluring for the mind of an introvert to have that kind of moment, both listening and
This is the beauty of podcasts. That was a very profound what you just said. Very self-aware. I mean, I can understand why you so enjoy doing a podcast, because you can have a safe, interactive conversation, which you still kind of control, right? Mm-hmm. I think podcasts are a wonderful, wonderful venue when done right. There is, though, if you do as many podcasts as I do, you learn that there's like a big, I call it a standard deviation, a big variability with podcast interviewers, right? There are interviewers like you who are obviously genuinely interested in what your guests have to say. Those are the best interviewers. There are others who are trying to convey to their audience that they are the smartest person in the room, and they're not going to let the guest hijack that space. So I can understand why you enjoy it so much. It's perfect. It's perfect for your.
I think so too. I'm having fun with it. I'm having fun today. Dan, I want to ask you about something you just brought up. which is the authentic, sincere way of going about it. Because when you read this book, you feel like, oh, it's a manual. I'll just start asking questions. But it's not that. And we're human, and we have this whole language that happens without words when we pick up on something and we realize that you're real, you're curious. But if you start faking it, it won't get you too far, and within minutes, people will tell you still have an agenda. You're just waiting to sneak in the question, would you buy my product or whatever it is. Can you talk about how we can't fake it? Others pick up on it. But if you're sincere about it, I wrote to myself that it's almost a superpower if you're truly sincere, authentic about it.
So I love that word superpower. I should use that more. It really is a superpower. People have a sixth sense for being manipulated.
Right.
And the problem with people who are modestly accomplished is it's easy to think that you're smarter than the person you're talking to. You get a lot of humility when you're a trial lawyer before a jury. And when you interview jurors afterwards and you see what they pick up on and the things that cause them to decide one way or another that you never even anticipated, you learn that you're not generally, we're overconfident in our own ability to be clever. So anything that's inauthentic is going to be ultimately not successful at all. People are gonna sense it, and it's gonna terribly backfire. So if you can't be authentic about it, then just do whatever is authentic for you. If whatever is authentic for you is dominating the conversation and talking, that's not going to be great, but it's going to be better than you being perceived as being deceptive and manipulative to try to get people to take action to benefit you economically.
Very true. When I read your book, I feel like it gives me an additional permission to be the way I think I am already. But it also gave me tools and understanding of the different pieces of why some conversations went so well. And some of them could have died down or were not what I expected them to be. I don't know. They just didn't work out in a very simple way looking at it. You just show the building blocks of a conversation. But the part that you alluded to that I want to come back to, you say how letting other people speak and tell their story actually helps us. And you mentioned how you receive all that information, but tell me more about that. How does it help us at the end of the day when we let them do the talking?
So help us is kind of subjective. So I need to wrap around some kind of a concept. Like if you are a financial advisor seeking to convert a prospect into a client, then one of the things that it's important for you to know is that humans are not rational. We like to think we're rational and objective, that if they're interviewing you and several other family office financial advisors, they're going to pick the best qualified. They think they are, but they're not. They're going to pick the one they like most. Likability is the coin of the realm. So when I thought about a process for financial advisors, it was really more, how do I become more likable? So if you look at the research I cite about what happens to your brain when you're talking, I think you might become more likable if you just let other people talk. And once you become more likable, the chance of their hiring you goes way up. They will believe that they hired you because you're the best qualified, and you may in fact be the best qualified. But the truth of it is, in the financial advisory business, this is a very high standard. I mean, most financial advisors I meet are highly qualified. So very little really differentiates them from their competition. Likability is the big differentiator. So that's how I got to that.
It makes me think of something that I share, that I'd like my clients to know that I care. And then I think about the doctors that I interact with, or the lawyers I interact with, or accountant that I have. How do I know that they care? I flip it on its head, or I turn it around. And I realize that I have this feeling that I know that they care because they know something about me, because they ask questions at some point. They understand my business. They understand my situation. They understand my journey, my story. And all of those things might not be directly relevant to the work, but I feel like they know me as a human being. And that's how I assume that they care. And I don't know if you have thoughts about it, but I feel like that's what's happening here when you allow the other person to share something about them. They see that you truly care about them as a human being in that context.
Two buckets in life, right? One is me, one is you. I can talk about me or I can talk about you. The more I talk about me, the less you're gonna feel like I care about you, because it seems to be all about me. All about the work I'm doing for you, all about the fees I'm generating from you, all about the fees I'm generating from other clients, none of which you have the slightest interest in. Or I could call you for no reason just to say, how are you? How are you and your wife doing? Are you going anywhere you travel a lot? What's the next trip? Right? Those people convey accurately that they really care. It's not just, I wrote a blog recently, like, is caring just a pretext for transactional? I mean, how do you tell if it's just, we know that most relationships are transactional. Your relationships with your doctor, your lawyer, and your accountant have a transactional element associated with them. We can prove this because if you stop paying them, the relationship will cease, right? So we know it has a transactional element. But some of them are able to convince you appropriately that their concern about you is greater than the fees that you're paying them. Those are the meaningful relationships in life. The way your wife doesn't have to explain to you every day how much she loves you. You know that because she cares about you.
I like that. I like the sound of that. I want to ask you about giving advice. And you, in your book, you have some advice about giving advice. And I laughed reading it because we love giving advice. When people come to us and they have a problem, we immediately want to give them advice. But you propose a slightly different way of going about it.
So here I'm kind of a hypocrite, right? Because it's following my own advice. I have 2 children, grown. Very difficult for me to follow this advice. But my advice is don't give advice. Even when you're asked, don't give advice, except in your area of expertise. You hire me as a coach, I'm going to give you advice, you're going to pay me. That's different from you saying to me, we're thinking of going to France or Spain, or we're having we have this problem in our lives, Dan, and what do you think? So the problem with giving advice is, especially when you're dealing, as most people are intelligent, right? Most people actually think through things. If I simply say, oh, here's the answer to that question, that reads as, what kind of an idiot are you that you couldn't think of this? You're agonizing over this problem. I just solved it in 10 seconds. I didn't even have to think about it. So advice can be deemed as dismissive and patronizing. Most people really don't want our advice. When my children ask for my advice, I'm always thinking, you're really just looking for validation. And so I have to train myself, even when I believe that what they're about to do, I hope they're not listening to this podcast, what they're about to do is really stupid. I will just say, well, I'm sure you guys know what you're doing. You've thought about this, and whatever you do, I'm sure will work out fine. I don't say that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard, because nobody likes.
So what's the difference, and how can they tell that you actually agreed with them that this was a good thing to do? And when you kind of hint that you don't actually believe it's a good idea.
I think they've read my book, so they're probably onto me, but it's very hard to do with people you love, because we've been around longer, right?
Mm-hmm.
We actually know more. We've learned a lot from making mistakes. And we don't want our loved ones to make the same mistakes and experience the same pain. But yet, if we tell them that, it's going to polarize them. They're not going to say, I always say this, how many times have you had an exchange with somebody else on a subject that you both care about, like a sensitive subject, religion, uh, pro-choice, not pro-choice, politics. You've presented your view, the other person presents their view, and at the end of that exchange of views, one person looks at the other and says, now that I've heard your view, I've changed my mind. This has never happened in my life. And I'm a trained advocate, right? This has never happened in my life. Sometimes I used to think, okay, I have a shot with a jury, but that's their job to like decide who's right. But in other contexts, it doesn't work. So giving people advice, if it's contrary to what they believe, the chance of changing their mind is very small. So I believe the best advice about giving advice is don't give advice.
Be a listener again. I think that's the advice. Be a listener in those moments and let them
ask
share.
questions. Yeah. Tell me why you feel that way. Tell me why you're going to do that. What kind of research did you do before you reached that conclusion? What did you find most persuasive? What do you think can possibly go wrong with that? I mean, you can ask questions that involve a dialogue. The key to life is asking questions. In the context of giving advice, instead of conveying information, just elicit information. It's very effective. Maybe they will say, maybe I should do more research. And then you could say, well, what more research would you do? And they'll tell you, and you'll say, it's a good idea. Do you think it would be helpful if we talked after you did the additional research? You can turn almost anything into a question.
You can turn almost anything into a question. I love that. Dan, I have to ask you about emotions and feelings. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of, you talked about the jury, but so many conversations in life where you want the emotions and feelings to be present. And you propose an exercise that's very thought-provoking. You ask people to take all the emotions out of the conversation. Ask questions as if you had no emotional response to what you were just told, even if it's something dramatic and life-changing and really something that affects the person you're talking to. Can you talk about this idea that it's helpful to add emotions and feelings into that interaction and conversation?
So this gets us back to a little bit of neuroscience, right? We know that data is not retained in the short-term memory, never mind the long-term memory. So you talk about wanting people to remember you, right? And you're a financial person. So when you're talking to people about expected returns, standard deviation, efficient market theory, a lot of data. When you're talking about that data, you should know that data is, they're hearing you. It's not like they don't understand the words that you're saying, but it's not going to be retained tomorrow. There's a lot of data that shows that when you do that, after like an hour, and ask them questions, people barely can remember what the subject was of what you're talking about. So I'll give you a great story because I thought about this before our meeting. I have a client. He's located in Texas, and he wrote me a very touching email about his background. I asked him about his background. What is your background? And he said, I'm a blue-collar guy in a white-collar profession. That is a great phrase. I mean, I knew it when I read it. I said, that's a great piece of writing. And 5 years from now, I'm going to remember that that's you. And then he gave me a proposal that he gave to a client, filled with data. He's a very smart guy, filled with data. I said, the proposal's honestly terrible because there's no emotion in the proposal. The proposal should be something about you, something more to the point, something about him, how doing this will impact his life and the life of his children and grandchildren, the legacy he wants to leave. Emotions not only stay in our short-term memory, but they stay in our long-term memory. So conversation without emotions can be done really well by computers. I'll tell you what's scary. I'm digressing a bit, but artificial intelligence, called effective AFF computing, is now making progress in having bots convey emotion, like in a therapeutic setting. And we're going to see in the future artificial intelligence emulating human emotions. That's truly scary and interesting. So anything devoid of emotions is just not effective communication.
It's fascinating because, again, we go through schools and education and we go through trainings and we don't talk about emotions. And I bring it up in the conversations here in this podcast, how, I went to school, I got my finance degrees, and we never talked about the client. And then I accepted my first job in New York, and I actually joined a meeting and I sat down with clients and we could build the most beautiful portfolio according to the best formulas and so on. But then there's a human being sitting on the other side. And they have emotions. They have an emotional response to what we're talking about. And you have to acknowledge it and make that the hero of the entire conversation. A portfolio is just a tool and just a setting that we're going to change and mold into an environment we're operating in. But how do they really feel is key. And I never took a course that taught it.
Let me just say this. You sit across from wealthy people, right? You haven't met them before. How unnatural it is. Say you have a person in front of you, they have a $10 million or $20 million portfolio, and they're meeting you for the first time. How unnatural is it not to say to that person, I'm really interested in how you got from where you were to where you are? Instead of, here's what we're going to do with your portfolio, here are the expected returns. I'm going to compare the expected returns to other returns and other portfolios. Here's why we should have alternative investments as part of your portfolio. Here's my view on cryptocurrency. Just saying to them, tell me how you got from where you were to where you are. What's it feel like to be you right now? To be sitting down with me planning this next stage of your life. Think about how that meeting would go if that was the conversation. That's how powerful emotions are.
I love that question. And I asked a version of it only a few days ago when a client, a prospect, was talking to me, and we went really far into the technical world, all kinds of questions he had for me. And I said, I do have to ask you, the money we're looking at, how did it even come? How did it come about?
Exactly.
Tell me the story behind it. And he had a beautiful story to share. And I felt like that's where we have to start. That's the heart of this conversation. So I intuitively knew that's what I want to hear, and everything else will follow. But tell me, why are we even here? Why there's an amount of capital to even talk about? Yeah, that's a
Very
beautiful
sensitive
question.
and thoughtful of you to do that.
Maybe that's your book making a quick impact on me already.
I'm glad. No, I think you've probably had a great head start. I think you probably were oriented that way, but that's only normal. I mean, I think the other approach is actually abnormal, right? To show no curiosity about people and just to say, okay, this is a transactional relationship. You've got money. I understand how to invest. Let me tell you how I'm going to invest. You decide whether or not you want to hire me. That to me seems on the, not even on the fringe, but seems very abnormal and odd.
I have a question for you about a 60-second lesson. And I wrote down for myself what would be a 60-second lesson from the book, and I'll share it in a second. But I was wondering about what you just said. And I grew up in a household with two doctors, physicians. And I think I took on a lot of their rituals and habits of being curious about people in their profession. And I never thought that it would be relevant in my profession, which is very technical, even scientific. We're investing money. And looking back, I think I took away a lot from my childhood home. Caring and being curious about the human on the other side, no matter if you're helping them with their knee, their heart, their eye, or anything else, or helping them with a family fortune. That's a very intimate, very important topic for them, and something that they could lose sleep over, and hopefully I can do something so they don't have to lose sleep over it. But caring about them and asking them questions just came naturally to me, and your book, if anything, empowered me to pursue this in that direction. But I want to ask you, and I wrote down to myself towards the end of my notes, what would be a 60-second lesson on having better conversations? And I wrote down a few things from your book. You said, stop talking, go second, don't interrupt, pause, show you're listening. Would you agree that would be a decent 60-second lesson?
Yeah, well done. Get rid of your agenda. No agenda.
No agenda.
And then do all of those things. Yeah, when you have no agenda, life gets very easy. It's complicated listening to you and then having an agenda of, oh, I've got to say this. What if I take that out of my brain? Just all I have to do really is listen to what your questions are and give you an honest answer. I don't have to show anything. I don't have to prove anything. You're interested. You're genuinely interested. I just have to answer. So yeah, when you get rid of your agenda, it's fairly easy to stop talking because the goal is to get the other person to speak if they're willing to talk to you.
It's counterintuitive when you really think about it, but that's the best way to go about it. Dan, I could hold you here all day, but I have one last question that I really like asking, and I ask my guests about their definition of success. How do you think about success, given all the wonderful experiences you've had and all the success you have?
Okay, so again, to avoid being a hypocrite, I can't say, oh, money is irrelevant to me, right? I have lived paycheck to paycheck, and I've had enough money not to have to worry about my future, and I've been happier having more money. So I want to say that, up front and being honest about it. But to me, success is contentment, lack of anxiety. I think if you have a lot of financial success, but you're anxiety-ridden, worried and concerned, you've lost the game of life. So when I reached the point in my life where I felt I'm really content with my life, that to me was the definition of success.
Do you remember the day, the moment? What was it?
I don't remember a particular moment, but it had to do with books. I remember when it's very hard for us to get out of our own way. We have our own lives, and we're all kind of limited, but we're all insular in some respects. But a point you made, I forget if it was before we talked or during our conversation about how books have an impact. Like one of my books was just translated into Persian and is being distributed in Iran. Another is in Chinese or Mandarin and is being distributed in China. When I started getting emails from people saying I'd impacted their lives in a positive way, or when I even got an email from you sent me a particularly nice email. I felt, I always felt like I would leave no footprints in the sand after I died and nobody would know I was here. But once I wrote books and people would say, oh, you changed I can retire now because I followed your advice. Or my relationship with my children is changed because I stopped giving them advice. That kind of adds drip by drip onto a feeling of, okay, I've achieved something and I feel happy and content.
I can tell that you left a lot of footprints and they're not in the sand. I can tell already.
I hope so. I try.
Dan, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate everything you shared with us today, and I highly recommend your book, Ask. And I feel like, as I told you before we started recording, I think the whole world would become an even nicer place if we all just listened instead of trying to talk as much as we can.
So thank you so much. It was great fun for me. I thoroughly enjoyed being with you, and I'm grateful to you for inviting me.
Thank you, Dan. You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show one click Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.